This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. It's been a tumultuous few weeks for Javier Milei, who faced a setback in a recent provincial election and then a huge vote of confidence from Donald Trump's White House. What lies ahead now for Argentina's self-described anarcho-capitalist president?
After the results of the local elections in the province of Buenos Aires, there have been some changes, not only in the narrative, but also in some focalized programs from some of the sectors that he had some tensions with, like, for example, pensions or the public hospitals that he had some trouble. We've seen some minor adjustments, but he's trying to give some signals. Having said that, he really believes in the path. We're in a president that he's very convinced on the ideology side. And one of his strengths, he believes, is that he really believes in this and he will go full motion on this path.
President Javier Milei needed a lifeline, and he got a big one from his friend President Donald Trump when the White House declared its intention to extend a $20 billion swap line to provide Argentina with more access to dollars. The deal isn't quite done yet. The two presidents are set to meet on October 14th, but there's no doubt the timing was good for President Milei, who was facing something of a crisis in financial markets and political trouble at home after a loss for Milei's party in provincial elections. That defeat raised questions about whether Milei had essentially peaked, whether after 2 years in which he made extraordinary progress on reducing inflation, but in which the real economy had stalled a bit in recent months, and a corruption scandal broke that allegedly involved his sister and closest aide. They deny wrongdoing. But perhaps amid all of this, the Argentine people had lost patience, as they have on so many occasions with austerity plans in the past. Alternatively, maybe this was just one of those proverbial bumps in the road. The support from President Trump can give Argentina the resources it needs to get through this crisis of confidence. Milei could still grow his support in Congress in midterm elections on October 26th. That's the election, the national election, that really matters. And if he does well, he could still have the political and social support he needs to continue his project of shrinking the Argentine state and reviving an economy that has seen seven recessions in the past decade or so. So which is it? Can President Milei secure the support he needs from the United States? Has he changed his tactics at all since the adverse provincial election result? To help us try to answer those questions, we've invited our friend Juan Cruz Díaz. Juan Cruz is the managing director of Cefeidas Group and senior advisor at America's Society and Council of the Americas, the organization that publishes AQ. Juan Cruz, welcome back to the AQ podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Brian. It's always a pleasure.
So, Juan Cruz, why was this bailout so important right now for Javier Milei?
Well, Brian, the economy in Argentina was under a lot of stress after the local elections in Buenos Aires a few weeks ago, where the government had a not very good performance. The markets began to be a little bit nervous about the stability and the sustainability of President Milei's program, and we saw a bit of complications in the macro stability that has been the brand of the President Milei for the last year and a half. The trip to New York for the UN General Assembly of President Milei and his team, and the bilateral meeting that the president had with President Trump was very timely. The response of Secretary Bessent and President Trump was very, very strong, and that helped the president to bring back stability to the markets in those days and confidence in the market that was much needed for President Milei and his team. So it was critical and timely.
I want to talk about the conditions within Argentina, but before we do, let's talk a little bit about this rescue package itself. What do we know at this stage about what the Trump administration is going to ask in return?
Well, Brian, actually, we don't know the details. I think the most important thing of this was the announcement itself, the symbolic gesture of President Trump and the strong support of Secretary Bessent, I think was the most important thing so far. We don't know the details and the conditions yet.
But we also know that, I mean, the Trump administration has allies around the world. They definitely consider Javier Milei an ally. Donald Trump has referred to him as his favorite president. But this is also a very transactional administration. They rarely give something in return for nothing. There's been speculation in the press that, a wide variety of things could be on the table, ranging from, some sort of preferential treatment for critical minerals to perhaps Argentina agreeing not to renew its currency swap arrangement with China. I mean, what are your expectations? Do you think that the letra fina, the fine print on this deal will end up being a challenge for this government, or do you think it will be more or less given for support purposes?
Let's remember that President Milei and President Milei administration and his economic team did a lot in advance in terms of alignment to the US. President Milei had a strong shift in Argentina's foreign policy. And also, there's an ideological alignment. Of course, there are ongoing negotiations in other fronts. As we speak, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is in Washington, D.C., advancing on the trade deal negotiations that the Argentine government hopes to announce soon, and other negotiations that probably will bring some light on the details of this support. But again, I think the most important element of this support is the political and symbolic element, in which we see that presidential diplomacy is very important right now with President Trump and President Milei, and where ideology and geopolitics play a big role.
So you don't see this as a fragile deal or one that will eventually become contentious because of its conditions?
There are things that can be a condition and things that can't. I think, for example, you mentioned the preferential treatment for critical minerals. But remember that natural resources are owned by the provinces in Argentina. So it's something that President Milei cannot decide by himself. And maybe some of the things that came out from the discussions that the US government was expecting President Milei to build more trust and more political sustainability in his relationships with the oppositions and governors. So that might be one thing. But again, those type of conditions need broad support in Argentina. So President Milei will need to build a more broad and stable political coalition.
So, Juan Cruz, let's talk about the politics behind all of this. Let's talk about President Milei. You noted that this rescue package happened at a time of some vulnerability for the administration, not only because of what was happening in the real economy, but because of what was happening in politics itself. This is a president whose popularity had been pretty steady for most of his presidency, but just as all this was happening, his popularity was starting to dip below the 40% level, which we know is critical for re-election and in this case for the midterm. He had also sustained this loss in the provincial elections in Buenos Aires province. How, if at all, has he evolved over the last couple of years? I mean, has President Milei shown any sign of sort of changing his tone or his tactics given the setbacks of the last couple of weeks?
Yes, the answer is yes. And he said that. I mean, after the results, and the disappointing results in the local elections in the province of Buenos Aires, he, accepted the results, which I think it's important, for all the problems that we are used to discuss in Argentine institutions. I think the electoral institutions are quite strong, and no one in the political system calls fraud in any of the elections. Cristina in 2017, when she lost the elections in the province of Buenos Aires, she didn't claim that it was a fraudulent elections, and she accepted the results. And now President Milei accepted the results, and I think that's an important thing. And President Milei said that he was going to moderate his narrative. His part of his style was a very eloquent a narrative and sometimes a violent narrative towards journalists or political opposition leaders. And he said that he was going to moderate that, and he has done that, and he's trying to reach out some governors. So we've seen some of that, some changes. But we need to say this: he's graduating as a mature politician. He was an outsider without much experience. He managed to sustain high levels of approvals, even in the context of huge cuts in the spending. And now, of course, you will need to do some adjustments to that. But again, if we put in context that it's a president that is sustaining, more or less 40% or roughly 40% of approvals in this context, I mean, it's pretty remarkable. Having said that, it will be quite challenging to have a strong performance in the next Congress. Even if he wins a substantial amount of seats, he will need to work a lot to build a broader coalition to pass some of the reforms that he is expecting to pass. A tax reform, a fiscal reforms, a labor reform, and others. So he will need to do more politics, and that's what everyone is expecting.
It's an interesting case, Juan Cruz, because you and I have both been doing this for a long time, and you learn to be skeptical of politicians or maybe just people who vow that they're going to change. It rarely happens. And it's also true that, a lot of these theatrics and this confrontational approach was what drew people to Javier Milei in the first place. I mean, in sort of polite international opinion, people tend to look down upon some of his the things he said and his antics, I suppose, over the years. But if you talk to people in Argentina, a lot of his base especially really liked that. So, changing or evolving away from that brings risks of its own. But on the other hand, you do see this evolution with him that you've pointed to. I mean, this was a guy who just, I suppose, 3 years ago, was not a particularly well-known economist who was occasionally on television. And you can see this learning curve that he's had, and maybe he's still evolving.
I would say so. Yeah, he has surprised most observers. I mean, there's a lot of problems. Of course, a lot of indicators are troubling, but I think he earned the right to be not underestimated in that sense. But again, having said that, now politics is playing, and he's consolidating the center right. We are seeing a lot of transformation in the Peronist side, in which, of course, Cristina is out of the game in her home detention. We've seen, other actors like Axel Kicillof, the governor of province of Buenos Aires, starting to rise his profile. And then we see a whole space in the center with some of the governors and other actors that are not comfortable with former Kirchneristas, and they're not comfortable with President Milei. So we have these three spaces, and we need to see how this plays out. And of course, polls have been difficult to predict what's happening. So we have these elections in just a few days, and this will be an amazing opportunity to see the real thermometer of where President Milei is at this point and how the next 2 years will look like.
Well, and at the same time, as you point out, it's not just about what the president says or does. There's an underlying reality here, which is the economy. And part of the reason we got to this point of vulnerability is because of this, disappointing recovery that we've seen in recent months in the real economy. And to just list a couple of these indicators that you mentioned, there was in July, a monthly economic activity indicator recorded a 0.1% decline compared to June. That has been sort of a trend this year. Unemployment is it's not that high, but it's stuck in this more or less 7.5% range. We saw an Ipsos consumer confidence index indicator registering a slight drop in August. That is also part of a trend. And I guess the big picture here is that even though the progress that President Milei has made on inflation has been remarkable, this really exuberant economic recovery that many people hoped for in 2025 has not met expectations for some people.
That's true. It's mixed, but with a lot of problems. That's true. And that mostly explains the electoral results, and that mostly explains the challenges that President Milei might face in the next elections. What the government is hoping is like if they can sustain the macro stability, the results are going to be seen in the next months to come. You will see more investment and so on. That's the big question. There's a lot of skepticism around it, but the president really believes this, and I think that's what he's putting on the table. He's telling the people we did a lot of efforts, and in order for these efforts to be meaningful, we need to have a bit more patience, and we will see the results in the months to come. And the question is if people will be patient and will believe in what the president is saying.
We'll be back after a short break. The Americas Society Gallery in New York City is a fantastic place to see art from Latin America. Our current exhibit is called Amazonia Azul. It's a truly unique pan-Amazonian show that brings together paintings, sculptures, photographs, and more from all 9 countries of the Amazon region. It's on view through April 2026. We hope to see you here. I suppose the fear that many people have, especially those of us who have followed Argentina for a very long time, is that we'll end up in another cycle like the one that swallowed up former President Macri, or if you go further back, you can point to a number of crises where an austerity program like this lost public support, and then everything came unraveled in a sea of protests, political instability, and worse. I want to make clear there's no signs we're anything close to that right now. But if you talk to investors, it's no secret that's what everyone fears. What's your feeling, Juan Cruz, about kind of where the mood of the streets is right now, given both the economic panorama that we just described and the political one as well?
I think every cycle is different. I think we can learn from history, but I think the situation is different. There are some protests around, but I don't see a level of social unrest and social mobilization that would ignite a deep crisis, a big social and political crisis in Argentina. That we are not seeing that in the streets.
You're a lawyer, I'm a journalist, but let me come at this question from a political perspective. We've both heard the criticism, even from people who are very supportive of President Milei, that this is a government that perhaps has focused too exclusively on the fiscal issue, that they've been so focused on, getting that under control that they've neglected investment, that they have not thought enough about consumer spending and other things. Without reflecting on the merit of that criticism, back to the question of is this a government that's changing right now? Do you hear or sense any awareness of that criticism and kind of a willingness to change? Or are they just full speed ahead on what they've been doing up until now?
I think for the president, it was very important to show investors that the path was there and it was not going to change. I think if he changed that and he compromised his fiscal responsibility policy, that will affect the investors' confidence. So he's being quite strong in saying that he's not going to change that path on one hand. But on the other hand, as I said before, after the results of the local elections in the province of Buenos Aires, there have been some changes, not only in the narrative, but also in some focalized, programs from some of the sectors that he had some tensions with, like, for example, the pensions or some of the, doctors and some of the public hospitals that he had some troubles on, and so on. So we've seen some adjustments, minor adjustment, but he's trying to give some signals. Having said that, he really believes in the path. We're in a president that he's very convinced on the ideology side. And one of his strengths, he believes, is that he really believes in this and he will go full motion on this path. So we'll see. I think the real reality check will be the elections in the next few weeks, and to understand that.
One more economic question for you, and then we'll move on to the politics. And, it is widely assumed that the peso is overvalued by about 20%, perhaps more, perhaps less, and that the government has intentionally maintained the peso at that level in order to keep a lid on inflation until the midterm elections have passed. Is it your sense that once the election's over, that there will be a significant adjustment?
I don't know. I really don't know the answer. I don't know if anyone knows the answer. The elements that we have now is that the president will try to maintain, as he has done in the month before, this financial program. And this financial program is maintaining the dollar within those bands in order to anchor inflation, to sustain the levels of inflation at this level is in the interest of the sustainability of the program, of the financial program and the political program. So I would say that I don't think that might be in the plans right now. If that happens, it might be an effect of a shock like we had a few weeks ago. But I believe that the government will try, if possible, to sustain the dollar in the bands that are expanding. Remember that these bands are not fixed. These bands are expanding until they manage to change the anchor in terms of inflation. And after the announcement of the support of the US government, really the dollar came back to the movement within the demand. The support of the US government and the tax holiday that they gave to the grain exporters in the last few days. But I think the government will try to sustain that. It's really hard to say what will happen in the future, Brian.
No, that is always true. Well, let's switch to the politics here, and let's talk about the president's closest advisor, which is his sister, Karina. She has occupied a role in this government akin to chief of staff. The president is always talking about in very strong terms about how she is the key figure in his government. At the same time, her name was mentioned as part of this corruption scandal or these corruption allegations that surfaced a couple of weeks ago. Both she and the president have denied any wrongdoing. My question for you is, do you expect any evolution in her role given these changes in the political landscape?
I mean, his sister is very important for the president. I mean, both politically and I would say personally. She's been critical in the developing of the campaign, the presidential campaign in the government. I mean, she's the most trusted advisor of the president and has been for a long time. So it's really hard to see a situation in which she is no longer there. And of course, they're denying any wrongdoing and they will investigate that. And I think that affected the government, no doubt. I mean, the timing was critical, not all, but a good percentage of what happened in the elections can be linked to all these allegations. I think the government will react, will defend, will fight this in Congress because there's a committee investigating in Congress, and eventually we'll fight this in the judiciary. But I think it will be part of the discussions and will be part of the political fight, but I don't see her leaving.
Juan Cruz, let me ask you to put your cards a little bit more on the table now and ask you what you think is going to happen in these legislative elections coming up at the end of October. What, in broad terms, do you currently expect the result to be, and how will that impact President Milei's ability to govern after it's over?
I think we will see a performance in which the government will be able to claim that they did very well in the elections. Because the starting point is just very few people in Congress that are directly linked to the president's party. And after this election, the next Congress will be a very substantial increase of that representation. If they sustain, a result in the high 30s, they might even win the elections because, the other voters are probably be divided in other different parties. They need to get some votes enough in Congress to be able to sustain any veto that President Milei issues. And that's a problem we saw in the last few weeks in which Congress has overturned some of the vetoes.
So you do not foresee the kind of nightmare scenario that I've heard whispers about where essentially the president loses the ability to govern and he faces like an existential risk during the final half of his term.
No, because they will probably win in several districts. So it's hard to imagine a nightmare scenario. I think any result, I think the government will try to spin it in a positive way. And again, in the mid to high 30s in the percentage at the national level, will probably seen as a good enough performance for the election. And of course, they will need to work a lot and build a coalition like they did in the first year of the government. Let's remember that they passed quite important laws with almost inexistent representation. So with a stronger representation in Congress, they build some broader coalitions. They might get some things done.
That coalition has been under some strain over the past year. I mean, prior to this week, my understanding is that former President Macri, who remains one of the main figures in the pro and the center right coalition that Javier Milei relied upon, I confess, somewhat surprised to hear that Macri and Milei had not spoken for more than a year, according to Macri. You get the sense that all is not well in that relationship more broadly, not just the two of them, but their different factions. I mean, are they going to be able to, smoke a peace pipe and get back together after this vote?
It is true that they haven't spoken a year. Having said that, they made an alliance and a coalition for these elections. The Pro Party is in a coalition with the President Party, and some representatives from Mauricio Macri met with Karina Milei extensively to build these coalitions for these elections. So they're running together in the city of Buenos Aires, in the province of Buenos Aires, and many other districts. So despite that they not have been in contact for the last year, basically the government is in a broad alliance with the Pro Party in most of the electoral districts. So I would say that the strategy of President Milei was to basically co-opt the Pro Party, and that strategy might be softened a little bit in the month ahead and give more space and visibility to President Macri. But I would say that coalition building is undergoing.
I want to ask you, Juan Cruz, about what's happening in the opposition, what's happening on the left. It's an interesting dynamic. As you mentioned, former President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner is under house arrest. There has been a lot of commentary around how her former finance minister, the now governor of Buenos Aires province, Axel Kicillof, has emerged as seemingly the new standard bearer of Kirchnerismo following his result in the provincial elections. How strong is the opposition right now, and how do you expect them to act going forward?
I think it's a moment of change. It's a moment of transformation in the Peronist movement. We might start hearing more about Peronism and less of Kirchnerism. Kirchnerism isn't a strong group within the Peronist movement, but I think we will hear more about Peronism and less about Kirchnerism.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, basically that there are several other leaders, not only Axel Kicillof, which was the one that came out first, but are willing to defy the leadership of Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner and some of her associates.
Does that mean that they might be more collaborative or at least less obstructionist with the Milei government?
No, that means that they might discuss some of the leaderships and the decisions within the party and the movement, like it happened with these elections. Let's remember that the decision to split the local elections to the national elections was a decision of the governor Axel Kicillof, and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. She was not aligned with that decision. Axel Kicillof defied Cristina Kirchner and Maximo Kirchner and was able to split the elections and had a good result on that. So the governor came out as stronger after that. And we might be seeing other leaders, local leaders, majors, and maybe other people in the provinces starting to be able to make decisions and defy some of the decisions that Cristina might take. remember that she cannot be a candidate and she's in home detention.
Final question for you, Juan Cruz. I mean, as I think about takeaways from this conversation, what I'm hearing from you is that we have a president who is aware of the need to change and is making some changes in terms of style, but maybe not that many in terms of actual content. Is that, in your mind, is that going to be enough to get him through the next phase of this, which is, really focusing on the recovery of Argentina's real economy in a way that will make people feel better about their day-to-day economic lives?
I think that was a good summary of the discussion that we have. And I would maybe respond to that saying that the difference with this president and other presidents is that this president really believes that the state has no role in many things that we're used to have the state having a role. So for the economy to start, having signs of recovery at the micro level, at the local level, and the sectorial level, it's something that the private sector, the market forces, and the economy needs to do without state intervention. And the president really believes that. And I think this is a matter of who's right on this. The president believes that this support that they have with the US and the good results in the elections will unleash a lot of forces. The president calls the heavenly forces that will make things happen. And many of the critics were saying, well, that's not going to happen. If you ask me, I think it probably will need more than a narrative change and a coalition building change. I think at the policy level, there will need to be more things done to see more fast recovery in some sectors. But I think the president has, very clear ideas, and those ideas are on the table for the next elections in October. And I think that's why these elections are quite exciting. Not always the midterm elections are exciting, and I think these are quite important.
Juan Cruz, very informative as always. Thanks so much for joining us on the AQ podcast.
Always a pleasure, Brian. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.